Inappropriate attire. That's what the security guard would say, his voice carrying the particular condescension of a man hired to enforce rules he didn't understand. They didn't know who was sitting in their bleachers. They had no idea the woman in rumpled nursing scrubs, the one they were about to humiliate in front of 2,847 parents and graduates, had once held a teammate spilling organs in her hands while bullets punched through concrete 6 inches from her head. The folded flag in her purse had been carried through 847 combat hours across 3 continents. But in 247 seconds, everything would change. Not because of who she was. Because of who was about to find out. The Raleigh Convention Center auditorium smelled like floor polish and carnations, that particular floral staleness of event venues where real life never quite landed. Danielle Ross sat alone in the back bleacher section, 3rd row from the end, her scrub still damp at the collar from the ICU's climate control. She'd left at 2:36 p.m. Signed out of shift report at 2:51 p.m. Got in her car at 2:59 p.m. Made the drive in 12 minutes flat, which meant she'd been pushing 65 through school zones, which meant she'd already accepted the professional consequence of being there at all. The hospital would have a note waiting. A conversation would be required. She'd already written the resignation letter in her head. Her hands were folded precisely over the small American flag in her lap, a triangle the size of a greeting card, edges worn soft from 6 years of constant handling. The flag had belonged to Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, her platoon's forward observer in Kandahar. She'd removed it from his uniform in the dust outside Phi Base Soyono while his blood was still warm on her hands. No one was supposed to know she had it. That was the entire point. The rule was absolute. No personal items. No mementos. No proof. But the flag had never left her purse in 2,347 days. It was muscle memory with fabric. Her son Marcus stood in the graduation line 3 sections over, still wearing the white undergraduate gown, his hair cut military short, something he'd done without discussing it with her, which meant he knew more than she'd told him. That was becoming apparent. His posture had changed last month. His handshake had gotten firmer. At 19 years old, he was starting to understand that his mother was different in ways that couldn't be explained by nurse or single parent or worked a lot of nights. He'd stopped asking where she went when she came home with sand in her boots. That was new. That meant something. The bleachers creaked under the weight of 2,000 people in their Sunday best, the collective sound of chairs shifting and programs rustling creating a kind of ambient noise that made it hard to think clearly. Danielle preferred silence. Silence was information. Silence told you who was nervous, who was angry, who was about to move. The chatter around her was mostly mothers comparing universities and job placement rates and housing costs, the comfortable anxieties of people whose worst-case scenario was a late tuition payment. Her worst-case scenario had a clinical name. PTSD. Classified briefing summaries. A Nevada address she wasn't supposed to remember. She didn't flinch when the walkie-talkie crackled 5 rows back. She didn't turn when the footsteps started. Her peripheral vision caught the security guard first, a young man named Torres, according to his name tag, with the soft face of someone who'd never been hit hard enough to change his expression. He was moving with the specific authority of a person who'd been given permission to enforce something. Behind him came another guard, older, with the weathered look of a real cop gone private. And behind them, moving with calculated precision, came Dean Patricia Mercer in a navy blazer that probably cost more than Danielle's monthly rent, her heels clicking against the concrete steps like a clock counting down. Danielle didn't move. That was the first tell. A guilty person would have stood. A nervous person would have shifted. She simply waited, her hand still folded over the flag, her breathing steady, her eyes forward on the graduation line where her son stood singing the alma mater with 10,000 other freshmen who had no idea how fragile the world was, how fast everything could break, how some of their parents had held that fragility together with their own 2 hands and never mentioned it at dinner. Torres reached her row first. "I'm going to need you to come with me." Not a question. The soft-faced ones never asked questions. They delivered orders as if questions were a luxury item they couldn't afford. "What's the issue?" Danielle's voice was steady. Level. The voice of someone asking a genuine question rather than arguing. That was her tell, but Torres didn't know that yet. Dress code violation. The university has a strict decorum policy. He glanced at his notes. He actually glanced at his notes. Appropriate business or formal attire only. Scrubs aren't. I came straight from Sacred Heart. The hospital name dropped like a credential, which it was. Had a code situation at 2:30. Couldn't change. The second guard exchanged a look with Torres, the universal gesture of men who didn't care about the circumstances, only the rules. But it was Dean Mercer who descended the bleacher steps with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was maybe 55, with the look of a woman who'd learned to weaponize etiquette. "Danielle. May I call you Danielle?" She didn't wait for permission. That was the whole strategy. Establish false familiarity. Remove the opponent's ability to control the encounter. "Dr. Mercer." Danielle had been expecting this. Not this moment specifically, but something like it. The way the dean's hand gripped the back of the bleacher seat in front of her, knuckles white, tendons taut, suggested panic beneath the smile. Danielle had seen that grip before. She'd seen it in the faces of men who knew they were about to lose something significant. "I'm afraid we're going to need to ask you to relocate." Mercer's voice was smooth, but there was an edge underneath it like rust on a blade. "Given your other visibility at the University Health Center last month, we'd prefer to avoid any confusion about appropriate." I dropped off a check. Danielle's statement was flat. Factual. For Marcus's housing. The bursar's office staff said I could deliver it in person. I did. Mercer's smile tightened. That's not how we handle these transactions. And frankly, after the incident at the facility, we'd prefer you coordinate these matters through official channels going forward. The word incident hung in the air like a smell. Danielle understood exactly what Mercer was referring to. 3 weeks ago, she'd been visiting the University Health Center for her employee physical, the one required for her contractor status as a hospital liaison. She'd needed to use the restroom. The hallway to the restroom had a small office visible through a door someone had left ajar. Dean Mercer had been in that office, shredding documents, talking on a phone about reallocated scholarship funds and donor money and creative accounting. The kind of conversation that ended careers. The kind of conversation that explained why Marcus's financial aid package had been downgraded 3 months ago, why 2 other students had suddenly been dismissed for disciplinary concerns, why the university's endowment had been showing suspicious withdrawals in the monthly reports Danielle's cousin had mentioned at Thanksgiving. What Mercer didn't know was that Danielle's cousin worked in the university's accounting department. What Mercer also didn't know was that Danielle's training included a very specific skill set related to information gathering, pattern recognition, and knowing exactly when and how to deploy what you'd learned. I understand, Danielle said, and meant it. She understood perfectly. This was stage 1. Social attack. Public humiliation. Establish dominance through institutional authority. Mercer had probably been practicing this speech since last month, probably thought she'd contained the situation, probably believed that the modest nurse in the hallway wouldn't make trouble. That was the consistent miscalculation of people with power. They couldn't imagine that the quiet ones were quiet by choice, not circumstance. Torres shifted his weight. "So you'll need to leave." Danielle turned to look at him, a full rotation, slow and deliberate. Torres flinched at her eyes. Just a micro-reaction, but it was there. Something in her pupils, maybe. Something in the way her gaze held his without challenge or fear, just observation. The kind of look that came from having assessed human beings in worse conditions than this convention center, having read threats in the dark at 5,000 meters, having decided in milliseconds whether someone was worth saving or not. "I'm going to stay," Danielle said. Her son was singing. 6 rows from the end of the line. 2 minutes until his section approached the podium. 2 minutes until his name was called and he stepped forward into the light and the flashing cameras, and she would be there to see it. My son is in the graduation line. I'm not leaving until his name is called. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Mercer leaned down, her hands gripping the bleacher seat on either side of Danielle's shoulders, and lowered her voice to a hiss that only the three of them could hear. People who don't belong need to learn their place. Danielle turned her head slowly. Met Mercer's eyes with the flat, arctic stare of someone who'd been called worse by people who had actual authority. The kind of stare that came from knowing that words were just air, that threats were just noise, that you'd already survived the worst decision you'd ever made and everything after was just administrative. I've removed tumors with more integrity than you, she said quietly. Not angry. Not even particularly upset. Just factual, the way you describe a medical procedure you'd performed 1,000 times. Mercer straightened. Her face flushed from jawline to hairline, the kind of visible rage that comes from being disrespected by someone you thought was beneath you. She opened her mouth. Closed it. This wasn't going according to her script. The nurse was supposed to apologize, or cry, or scramble to explain. Instead, Danielle was standing up with perfect composure, gathering the flag from her lap, preparing to walk away before anyone had won the exchange, which was actually winning it completely. I'm going to the lobby, Danielle said to Torres. I'll wait there for the ceremony to move to the next section. Then I'll come back. You can call security again if it makes you feel better. But my son's name is going to be called, and I'm going to hear it. She paused. Both of you want to explain to the Raleigh PD why you removed a nurse from her son's graduation, or should I do it? The reference to police was subtle but effective. It introduced the possibility of a complaint that would be exponentially more troublesome than her presence. Torres's face went pale. The second guard looked at his shoes. And Mercer's hands unclenched from the bleacher, her breathing visible in the tight rise and fall of her chest, her mind visibly processing the fact that this encounter had not gone according to plan. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what would change everything. That part was waiting. What Danielle didn't know, standing in that convention center bleacher with her son's name about to be called and her military career folded into the bottom of her purse like a secret she'd never told anyone, was that everything was about to become visible. The quiet was about to end. The secret was about to become impossible to keep. The graduation line moved forward. Marcus's section began ascending the podium steps. Danielle moved to the lobby as promised, the flag still in her hand, her phone already buzzing with a message from Sacred Heart ICU. Code Blue. Trauma patient arriving. She read the message and didn't move. Heard her son's name called and walked back into the auditorium just as his photo flashed on the screen. Watched him smile for the cameras, unaware that everything he thought he knew about his mother was about to change, that the quiet nurse who worked nights and never talked about her past was about to stop being quiet, that the woman in rumpled scrubs holding a folded flag from Kandahar was about to become visible in ways that would change not just his life, but everyone else's too. She had 16 minutes until the ceremony ended. 16 minutes until she could leave. Then she'd go back to Sacred Heart, back to the ICU, back to the life nobody understood. Back to waiting for the moment when the world figured out what she already knew, that the bravest thing you could do was show up to the places that mattered, even when showing up cost you everything. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The audience applauded. Danielle stood perfectly still, holding the flag, watching her son become what he was always going to be, a man with a mother he still didn't fully know. The room went dead silent. Dean Patricia Mercer stood 3 rows below, burgundy blazer catching the gymnasium lights, her smile sharp as a scalpel. She leaned forward until her shadow fell across Danielle's lap, across the folded flag from Kandahar that never left her purse. People who don't belong need to learn their place, Mercer hissed, her voice low enough that only Danielle could hear, but her body language loud enough that everyone was watching. Danielle didn't move. Didn't blink. Her hands remained folded over the triangle of fabric, stars and stripes folded so precisely the creases looked etched with a razor. She looked up at Mercer with eyes the color of winter iron, and when she spoke, her voice came out like a scalpel cutting through muscle tissue. I've removed tumors with more integrity than you. The words landed like a defibrillator paddle. Mercer's face flushed deep crimson. She opened her mouth. Closed it. The champagne flute in her other hand trembled slightly before she set it down on an armrest with deliberate precision, a gesture meant to convey control while her jaw clenched so hard her temples flexed. Danielle stood. Smooth. Deliberate. No hurry. No fear. She stood the way a combat medic stands after stabilizing a hemorrhaging soldier, not leaving, simply repositioning. Her scrubs, still damp from the ICU, still carrying the faint chemical ghost of antiseptic and spent adrenaline, seemed to expand in the silence. The wrinkles caught the overhead lights like topographic lines on a military map. Torres, the security guard, appeared at the end of the bleacher row. He was built like a fire hydrant with shoulders, his radio crackling with static. "We're going to need to escort you out now," he said, not unkindly, but with the practiced firmness of someone who'd been trained to remove people who broke rules. Danielle tucked the folded flag into her pocket. The weight of it settled against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She didn't argue. Didn't explain. She simply nodded, a single, precise gesture, and walked toward the aisle. But as she passed her son in the graduation line, Marcus reached out, his mortarboard tilted, his face a collision of confusion and shame. His mouth opened as if to say something. Danielle met his eyes for exactly 1 second, and in that second she conveyed with perfect clarity, "Not your fault." Then she turned away and followed Torres down the bleacher steps. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the convention center, rubber soles on metal, a rhythm like a ticking clock counting down something irreversible. But as Danielle walked, her mind fractured into memory. 3 weeks ago. The University Health Center. She'd been dropping off Marcus's housing payment in person because his father had missed the deadline again, and Danielle had learned years ago that some things you couldn't trust to mail or email. She'd been walking down the corridor toward the bursar's office when she'd passed an open door, Mercer's office door, the nameplate reading Dean of Student Affairs, and inside, Mercer had been standing at a shredder the size of a trash compactor, feeding documents into its metal teeth with both hands. The phone pressed to Mercer's ear had been glowing. Danielle had only caught fragments. "Yes, I understand the donor's position. No, the scholarship reallocation is completely untraced. The parents won't know until next fall when acceptance letters don't arrive. The money stays in the unrestricted fund, just like we discussed." The shredder had hummed like an insect swallowing evidence. Danielle had kept walking. Had submitted the housing payment. Had driven back to Sacred Heart and clocked in for her shift without mentioning it to anyone. But 3 days later, when that same Dean Mercer had filed a trespassing complaint against her for being in a restricted university facility, Danielle had understood Mercer didn't want witnesses. Danielle had seen something. Danielle had become a problem. The campus security checkpoints had started after that. Mercer's calls to the hospital, 3 of them, each one carefully crafted to raise concerns about Danielle's stability and judgment. The pressure on the health center director to revoke Danielle's professional courtesy access. The slow, methodical campaign to make Danielle Ross into someone who didn't belong anywhere at all. Now, walking through the convention center parking structure with Torres, Danielle could feel the architecture of Mercer's strategy crystallizing. This wasn't random cruelty. This was calculated removal. Mercer had seen something that day in the office, something about Danielle that made her dangerous. Maybe it was the way Danielle's eyes had catalogued everything. Maybe it was the military bearing that never quite went away no matter how many years she spent in scrubs. Maybe it was something else entirely. The parking garage was cool, concrete and steel and the ghost of exhaust fumes. Their footsteps echoed across the empty spaces. Torres walked 2 steps behind, maintaining professional distance, his radio crackling periodically with dispatch chatter from other sections of the convention center. "Look," he said, not unkindly, "whatever's going on between you two, Dean Mercer's got pull with the board. You don't want to be on the wrong side of that." Danielle didn't respond. Her 2012 Honda Civic was 3 rows down, navy blue, the kind of car that didn't attract attention because it was designed not to. She'd bought it specifically for that reason 8 years ago, when she'd taken the medical discharge papers and the psychiatric separation from the Navy and decided she needed to become someone who blended in. Someone quiet. Someone invisible. Someone who'd learned that the most dangerous thing a person could do was let their guard down. Her phone buzzed as she reached the driver's side door. Text from Marcus's father. "What the hell did you do? You embarrassed him on his biggest day." Another, "This is exactly why the custody arrangement needs to change." Another, "You always do this. You always ruin things." She silenced the phone. Didn't read the rest. Torres had stopped 20 feet back, maintaining the boundary between escort and harassment. He was a decent man, probably had kids himself, probably felt like he was caught between competing loyalties. Danielle appreciated that. In another life, under other circumstances, they might have been friends. But Torres was also an instrument of Mirza's will, which meant Torres was briefly an obstacle in the machinery of her own survival. Danielle's hand was on the car door handle when the phone didn't buzz. It screamed. The emergency alert was a full-system notification, the kind that overrode silent mode and played through speakers at maximum volume, ***, code blue room for ICU Sacred Heart ***. Then immediately, ***, Barnes cardiac arrest surgeon 20-minute out need all hands ***. Danielle's vision tunneled. Everything else, the parking garage, Torres, the graduation ceremony, her son's confusion, receded to the edges of her perception like a photograph going out of focus. Lieutenant Commander James Barnes. SEAL Team 3. 3 days in her ICU with post-surgical complications from a routine appendectomy that had turned into a nightmare of bleeding and infection and the kind of cascade failure that hospitals trained for but prayed never to see. The same James Barnes who, 8 years ago in a command tent outside Kandahar, had ordered her to execute a prisoner who was refusing medical treatment and had become what command saw as a liability. She'd refused. He'd court-martialed her for insubordination. She'd been dishonorably discharged on paper as a psychiatric separation, her career erased, her future handed to her in a manila envelope stamped PTSD and unsuitable for service. The same man she'd been assigned to monitor in the ICU, the man whose name on a chart had made her hand shake so badly that she'd had to sit down for 15 minutes before she could breathe normally again. The same man who was now in cardiac arrest. She didn't think. Muscle memory took over, the kind of memory that lives in bones and muscle tissue, in the part of the brain that doesn't have a voice. She moved. Fast. No hesitation, no calculation, just the pure physics of a body trained for crisis response activated by stimulus. Torres called out, confused, as Danielle sprinted past him toward her car. She didn't respond. She unlocked the door with one motion, threw herself into the driver's seat, started the engine. The car had been running regularly, she maintained it religiously, and the transmission engaged like clockwork. She was in reverse before the parking brake was fully released, the tires squealing against concrete as she executed a 3-point turn in a space meant for one car. 70 miles per hour through a 45 zone. Hands locked on the steering wheel, white-knuckled, her breathing controlled and mechanical like the ventilators in the ICU. The folded flag from Kandahar, the one she'd carried through graduation, the fabric from a fallen teammate's uniform, the thing she never let out of her sight, slid across the passenger seat and wedged against the door. The hospital emergency entrance loomed ahead like a massive mouth. She could see it from a mile away on the approach road, the red and white logo, the rotating door, the ambulance bay where 3 trucks were parked with their lights off because there was always something happening. Her phone buzzed again, ***, patient coding family refusing DNR continue rhesus ***. No time. No thought. Just action. She parked in the ambulance bay, illegally, brazenly, with complete disregard for protocol, and ran. The emergency doors slid open before she reached them, sensing her motion, and the smell hit her like a wave, antiseptic and blood and something burning, the particular chemistry of human crisis. The ICU was 3 floors up. Stairs were faster than elevators. Her legs carried her up the concrete steps 2 at a time, the sound of her soles echoing like a military march, rubber on concrete, a rhythm that meant forward, always forward, never backward. Room 4 was at the end of the corridor. She could hear the code before she saw it, voices calling vitals, the hiss of bag valve mask ventilation, the electric whine of the defibrillator charging, someone's voice saying, still in VFib, shock didn't convert. She burst through the doorway into organized chaos. The senior resident was at the head of the bed doing compressions, the nurse was bagging, the tech was recording, and no one looked up as Danielle entered because interruptions during codes meant death. But the attending, Dr. Raymond Chen, who'd worked with Danielle for 4 years and had learned to trust her instincts like radar, looked up for 1 second. That second was enough. "Get the crash cart," Danielle said. Her voice was different now. The voice of someone who'd spent 18 months as a combat medic in Kandahar, who'd kept people alive in conditions that shouldn't have allowed survival, who understood that some situations required not hesitation but action. "We're going to need the thoracotomy tray. Now. Not in a minute. Now." No one questioned her. Years of working in trauma had trained every person in that room to recognize authority that came from competence, not rank, and Danielle's voice carried the weight of someone who'd made those calls before and had been right. She was already moving to the bedside, already pulling on sterile gloves from the cart with mechanical precision, her eyes scanning the monitor, VFib still, no response to current interventions, blood pressure unmeasurable, pupils already starting to dilate. The surgery had been 26 hours ago. The post-op course had been deteriorating for 18 hours. Whatever infection or bleeding had started was now catastrophic. "How long?" she asked, her eyes never leaving the monitor. 16 minutes of code, Chen said. 2 rounds epi, 1 round amiodarone, defibrillation times 4. Nothing's converting. Family here. Waiting room. Wife and daughter. Refusing DNR. Of course they were. Of course they were refusing to let him die because they didn't understand that the machine was already gone, just the electricity was keeping the meat moving. But that wasn't Danielle's decision. Her decision was simpler: could she fix this? The crash cart had arrived. The thoracotomy tray was being unwrapped. The attending was looking at her with that expression, the one that said asterisk, "What are you going to do?" asterisk. And Danielle was going to do what she always did. She was going to fight. The code blue alert hit her phone at 4:24 p.m., parking lot C, level 3, while the security guard was still talking behind her about procedures and university policy. Code blue room for ICU Sacred Heart. Her thumb moved before her brain caught up. The second message came through as she was unlocking her Honda, Barnes cardiac arrest surgeon 20-minute out. Danielle stopped moving. Her hand froze on the door handle. Lieutenant Commander James Barnes. The same James Barnes who'd filed the court-martial paperwork 8 years ago in Kandahar. The same man whose signature was on the document that ended her Navy career for refusing an illegal order, an order that would have killed 17 Marines under her direct care. The same man she hadn't seen in 3,000 and something days. She got in the car anyway. The 2012 Honda screamed out of the parking structure, tires burning through the turn at the payment booth. Behind her, the security guard was shouting something, his voice swallowed by the engine noise and the wall of late afternoon heat pressing through the open windows. Danielle's jaw was a single line of compressed muscle. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way she'd been taught in a different life, in a different uniform, when people had saluted her instead of removing her from public spaces for inappropriate attire. 20 minutes. The surgeon was 20 minutes out. Barnes was already losing time. She hit I-40 doing 75, weaving through afternoon traffic with the precision of someone who'd navigated convoy routes through hostile territory. The folded flag from Kandahar sat in the center console where she'd placed it that morning, the one she always carried, the one that had been pressed into her hands by a corporal named Mike Chen, who'd bled out in her arms while she'd applied direct pressure and whispered promises she couldn't keep. Dean Mercer had nearly brushed it aside during the graduation ceremony removal, treating it like a decorative prop, a sentimental nurse thing, not understanding that flags folded like that meant something entirely different. Sacred Heart Medical Center appeared on the horizon like a promise. Danielle pulled into the emergency bay, not parking, abandoning the Honda with the hazards flashing and the engine still running. The automatic doors opened and the smell hit her first, that precise combination of antiseptic and industrial cleaner and the copper iron scent of blood that meant the ICU was already in full crisis mode. She didn't run. Gunnery sergeants didn't run. But the hallway from the ER to the ICU was exactly 187 steps, and she covered it in 12 seconds. Badge swiped. Code blue notification on the overhead pages cascading like artillery. Room 4. The door was open. She could already hear the sound before she saw it, that specific rhythm of a code team that was losing ground. Compressions too shallow. Ventilations coming too slow. The mechanical beeping of a monitor that was showing VFib again, resistant to everything they were throwing at it. 2 residents rotated chest compressions over James Barnes's grey-blue chest, their hands rising and falling with the desperation of people who knew they were watching a man die. The respiratory therapist was bagging, her movements becoming more frantic as the minutes accumulated. A surgical tech stood at the crash cart looking at the attending physician, Dr. Raymond Chen, with the expression that meant everyone in this room knew they were running out of time. Barnes lay motionless except for the violence being done to his sternum. His face was the color of old concrete. His lips had taken on that terrible blue-gray tone that meant hypoxia, meant the oxygen debt was accumulating in his tissues, meant the window for meaningful recovery was closing with each heartbeat that the defibrillator failed to restore. Danielle moved past the threshold and into the room. No one stopped her. No one questioned a woman in scrubs during a code. That was one of the unspoken rules, one of the few pieces of mercy in the hierarchical catastrophe of emergency medicine. She was already moving her eyes across the monitor, reading it the way some people read language. Flattening QRS complexes. No P waves. The heart had stopped thinking and started just misfiring. Cardiac tamponade. The surgical site was bleeding into the pericardium, the sac around the heart was filling with blood, and every compression was pushing against a closed fist instead of an open chamber. Cardiothoracic surgeon, she asked. Her voice didn't sound like the voice that had left the graduation ceremony. It sounded like something forged in different heat. Dr. Chen looked up, confusion crossing his face. You're not scheduled. You need to. How long until the surgeon arrives? 18 minutes if traffic cooperates. But you can't. Danielle's eyes moved to the monitor. 7 minutes of inadequate perfusion. The pupils dilating. The slight discoloration starting in the fingertips that meant organ death was already beginning its slow march through the body. She'd seen this before. Not in a hospital with a full code team and backup and a surgical suite 3 floors away. She'd seen this in a compound in Kandahar with mortar fire shredding the concrete walls and dust so thick you could taste the copper of spent ammunition, and your hands were the only instrument you had available and you had to choose between following protocol and saving lives. She'd chosen saving lives then. She'd never regretted it, even though it cost her everything. I need a thoracotomy tray, she said. Now. Dr. Chen blinked. His mouth opened. You're a floor nurse. You can't perform. 8 minutes before permanent brain damage, Danielle said. Her voice was ice in a warm room. Get me a scalpel or I open him with my trauma shears. The room went silent. The only sound was the mechanical hiss of the ambu bag and the relentless beeping of the monitor and the wet slick of compressions pushing against a dead heart. Chen stared at her, seeing something in her eyes that made him step backward, not fear, exactly, but the recognition of someone who had already crossed ground where he'd never walked. He nodded to the surgical tech. They worked with the coordination of a team that didn't have time for hesitation. The surgical tech stripped off Barnes's dressings with speed that bordered on violence. Someone, a resident, placed a drape. Betadine solution hit the skin in an orange cascade. Danielle held her hand out and the scalpel appeared in her palm like a completed prayer. The incision went between the 3rd and 4th ribs, exactly where it needed to be. Muscle memory didn't take over. Muscle memory was something other people talked about when they wanted to understand things they couldn't quite grasp. What took over was something deeper. Something that recognized this space, the inside of a human body in crisis, the way some people recognized home. Her hands moved through the fascial layers and opened the ribs with rib spreaders, the mechanical sound like cracks in ancient ice. Blood welled up. Arterial. The surgical site was compromised, the graft or the repair or whatever they'd done to him before the arrest had failed, and now the space inside his chest was filling up like a bathtub. She reached in with her right hand, and the Kandahar compound overlaid itself perfectly over this sterile ICU. The mortar fire became the sound of the code team's equipment, the dust in her throat became the artificial coolness of the hospital AC, and the 17 Marines waiting for her became one Navy SEAL with grey skin and a heart that had stopped thinking. Her fingers found the heart. Massage. Direct compression. The muscle was cool under her palm, but it was still there, still present, still capable of response. The monitor showed nothing. She pushed harder, feeling for the rhythm, for the spark that would tell her the organ was remembering how to work. Compressions. Release. Compressions. Release. The trained motion of hands that had learned this skill under different circumstances, with different stakes, with the understanding that if this didn't work, a man died. The monitor beeped. Then again. Then established a rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Not perfect, not strong, but present. The heart had remembered how to beat. Jesus Christ, Dr. Chen whispered. Where did you learn? The door crashed open. Danielle's hand was still inside Barnes's chest, her fingers still maintaining the pressure that was keeping him alive, when Dr. Patricia Mercer stood in the doorway with 2 hospital security officers and the chief of medicine behind her. Their faces had that expression that meant someone had made a phone call and a decision had been made at the administrative level, and now the mercy of a code team performing miracles was about to become a problem of institutional liability. The scalpel felt like coming home. Danielle's fingers closed around the blade and the world compressed to 14 inches of stainless steel and the space between ribs. The code team froze. She was the bedside nurse, not the surgeon, but her voice had dropped 2 octaves and acquired the weight of command. Move. They moved. The thoracotomy tray came forward. Danielle's hands found the 5th intercostal space without hesitation, the same anatomical landmark she'd memorized in Kandahar when a field hospital was a collapsed compound and morphine was rationed, and 17 hours meant the difference between 14 lives saved and 14 flag-folded notifications to families who'd never recover. The blade parted skin like muscle memory speaking its native language. She didn't think about Dean Mercer standing in the doorway. Didn't acknowledge the chief of medicine's sharp intake of breath or the security officer's frozen mid-approach like they'd been paused on video. Her focus was absolute: sternum, ribs, the pleural space, and then the pericardium. She could feel the cardiac tamponade before she saw it, the pressure around Barnes's heart like a fist clenching something that needed to beat. Blood spilled across her gloved hands, warm and urgent, and she opened the pericardium with a single precise motion. The heart lay exposed, still, failing. She reached inside his chest and her fingers closed around his heart. Direct cardiac massage. The procedure they teach in military medicine when the patient is dead and the alternative is definitely dead. When you've got nothing to lose and seconds are currency you don't have. Danielle's hands began to move with the rhythm of someone who'd done this before, who knew the weight and resistance of human cardiac tissue, who understood that this motion was the difference between sinus rhythm and a family's worst day. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The monitor showed nothing. She worked. 15 seconds. 20. The attending surgeon was running toward the room, but Danielle was already there, already operating in the space where civilian medicine ends and survival begins. 30 seconds. 40. The fluorescent lights hummed their hospital hymn and someone was calling out vitals, BP still nothing, O2 sat climbing incrementally, and then. The monitor beeped once. Then again. Then again. Sinus rhythm. A heartbeat that hadn't existed 40 seconds ago, that now existed because Danielle Ross had reached into a dead man's chest and reminded his heart what it was supposed to do. She didn't celebrate. She sutured. The attending surgeon stood frozen for precisely 2 seconds before muscle memory took over his own body and he was moving, checking the repair, nodding, perfect, clean, exactly what a thoracotomy should look like. Danielle worked with the precision of someone closing a wound she'd already closed 100 times in her mind, the same meticulous technique she'd used in a collapsing compound while bullets made percussion sounds against concrete. Each stitch was placed with attention. Each knot was tied with certainty. Barnes's eyes flickered open as she completed the final closure. Confusion. Pain. Recognition, a flicker of something in his gaze that suggested he knew who was standing over him, his hand stained with his own blood, her face a mask of professional composure. His lips moved but nothing came out except a wheeze and the ventilator's mechanical answer. She stepped back from the bed. That was when Patricia Mercer moved. The dean approached Dr. Chen with the velocity of someone who'd already calculated every move, and Danielle watched the tactical shift with the clarity of a soldier recognizing an incoming attack. Mercer's voice carried through the ICU, projected for maximum audience. That nurse abandoned her post. Violated hospital protocols. Performed an unauthorized surgical procedure. We have documentation of erratic behavior, mental health concerns, and now potentially criminal conduct. Danielle's hands were still gloved in Barnes's blood. She removed them slowly, methodically, the latex peeling away like shedding an old skin. She didn't turn around. She didn't defend herself. Composure wasn't something you performed when people were looking. Composure was what you did when they were, when every gesture could be weaponized against you, when silence was the only safe response. She has an active complaint with campus security, Mercer continued, her voice gaining momentum like she'd rehearsed this. There's an obscure Joint Commission regulation regarding staff with unresolved legal disputes involving patient families. This patient is military, she has a sealed service record, we have no way to verify there's no conflict of interest. This was reckless. Dangerous. Frankly, it's actionable. Dr. Chen started to speak but Mercer cut him off with surgical precision. I've already drafted the incident report. Unauthorized departure during shift. Emotional dysregulation. Trespassing allegations from the university. It's all documented. She produced a tablet like a closing argument, the screen glowing with emails already composed, waiting only for signatures and timestamps. The chief of medicine, Dr. Howard Liu, whose hands had taught a generation of surgeons, reviewed the fabricated documentation with the expression of someone performing administrative theater. His eyes flickered up to Danielle. Ms. Ross. Pending investigation, you're suspended effective immediately. Your credentials are flagged pending a full review. Danielle nodded once. She unwound her stethoscope from her neck with the same care a soldier uses removing ammunition from a weapon before turning it in. The scope was cool in her hands, the tubing pale blue and worn from 18 years of use. She coiled it precisely, each loop deliberate, and set it on the nurse's station where others might claim it. She didn't argue. Didn't explain. Didn't cite the fact that she'd just performed a procedure that saved a man's life with a precision that surgeons train for years to achieve. Her face had been carved from something harder than marble, from igneous rock formed under pressure, something that wouldn't fracture. She walked to the locker room and changed out of her scrubs. That evening, in the hospital laundry room, the place where dirty work was made clean again, where bloodstains were bleached out and surgical errors were laundered into professional detachment, Danielle folded her scrubs for the last time. The room smelled like industrial bleach and hot cotton. The machines hummed their mechanical songs. She was alone with the folding, the endless folding, the return of a uniform like a prisoner surrendering property that no longer belonged to her. Each crease was perfect. Aligned with the precision she'd once used folding her dress blues 18 years ago, before the thing in Kandahar that couldn't be spoken about. Before the sealed court-martial records and the career that ended in classification and the decision to disappear into nursing because healing others felt like the only redemption available. The folded flag from her last deployment, the one she'd carried from her kit after the compound fell, after the teammate she'd held together stopped needing holding, sat heavy in her jacket pocket. She'd brought it to the hospital today to remind herself of why she was here. To remind herself that she'd chosen this quiet life saving lives in the dark, this anonymity that felt like penance and like peace in equal measure. Now her hands trembled as she pressed the final crease. She'd spent 18 years running from recognition, from medals, from the attention that came with being the thing she'd been. She'd wanted nothing but to disappear into competence, into the invisible work of keeping people alive, into the grateful anonymity of being just a nurse. The universe, it seemed, had other plans. By Monday morning, the university's mandatory background refresh, implemented by Mercer herself to justify the new security theater, had processed Danielle's information through federal channels. The classified flag triggered at JSOC headquarters at 10:16 a.m. By 2:13 p.m., 3 men in Navy dress whites arrived at the rescheduled graduation ceremony for academic honors recipients. Marcus stood in the reception area wearing summa cum laude robes, his mother's absence a question mark no one was asking him directly. The Dean of Student Affairs, Patricia Mercer, already nervous about something she couldn't name, stood near the podium when the first man approached the microphone. A Master Chief Petty Officer, his face creased with 30 years of decisions that had cost him things he couldn't talk about, his uniform a wall of decorations earned in places they still didn't put on maps. "We're looking for Danielle Ross," he said. His voice had the quality of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Or as we knew her, Gunny Ross." The room stopped. Parents paused mid-conversation. Faculty members turned. Marcus's honors cord slipped from his fingers. A Navy chaplain opened a leather folder with the deliberation of someone reading scripture. From a unit citation, dated 7 years ago, Operation Enduring Freedom, Kandahar Province. For extraordinary valor, Gunnery Sergeant Danielle Ross performed combat casualty care under sustained enemy fire for 17 continuous hours, refusing medical evacuation until every teammate was stabilized. Her actions directly resulted in 14 lives saved. 14 lives. The number hung in the air like ammunition. A rear admiral stepped forward, his chest a cartography of service, medals stacked like chapters in a book written in blood. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. He paused. Staff members were pulling out phones, Googling frantically, their faces registering the impossible collision between the quiet nurse who'd been removed from her son's graduation and whoever this woman was. Silver star with Valor device. Purple heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. Between each medal, there was a breath. A moment for the magnitude to settle. By the time the rear admiral finished, Marcus was pale, his hands shaking slightly, understanding that everything he'd believed about his mother was incomplete. A 4th man in a dark suit stepped forward. No insignia. No introduction needed. The agency knew Sergeant Ross by a different designation, one that remains classified. Her service record includes operations in 7 countries. She voluntarily walked away from a military career to focus on healing both others and herself. He turned deliberately toward Patricia Mercer. "We also know she witnessed financial irregularities at this institution 3 weeks ago. Federal investigators have been building a case regarding misappropriated scholarship funds since her initial observation." He held up a federal badge. The light caught it like a weapon. "FBI. Dr. Mercer, you're being served." The same security guard, Torres, who'd escorted Danielle from the convention center just days ago, approached the dean with a cardboard box. His face carried the satisfaction of someone who'd finally been given permission to speak truth to power. "For your office contents. I believe you know the way out." Patricia Mercer's career ended in that moment, not with fanfare but with a cardboard box and the sound of her own footsteps walking away from everything she'd built through intimidation and fabrication. The university would find $847,000 in unaccounted scholarship funds. The federal investigation would expand. By spring, there would be a perp walk, a resignation, and eventually a plea deal. But none of that mattered in the room right then. What mattered was Marcus finally understanding why his mother carried herself like she was holding something fragile and vital at the same time. What mattered was the quiet, measured respect beginning to bloom in people's eyes as they watched the invisible woman become suddenly, undeniably visible. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The university's mandatory background refresh for all campus visitors, ironically implemented by Dr. Mercer herself to justify stricter security protocols, ran Danielle's name through the federal database at 3:38 p.m. on a Tuesday. The system flagged her immediately. Classified. No further access granted. Within 4 hours, a phone call reached the Raleigh Convention Center administration. Within 6, 3 men in navy dress whites were walking through the parking lot toward the rescheduled honors ceremony that Marcus had postponed, unwilling to graduate without his mother present. The first was a weathered Master Chief, his uniform bearing ribbons that stretched across his chest like a topographic map of 30 years in salt water and sand. His face carried the kind of stillness that came from having made decisions that cost lives. The second wore chaplain insignia, a smaller man with the careful composure of someone trained to speak at funerals. The third was a rear admiral, silver stars on his shoulders, the kind of authority that made lieutenants straighten their spines just from proximity. They moved through the convention center corridors with the fluid precision of apex predators, and nobody stopped them. Authority requires no credentials when it radiates from the chest outward like body heat. The rescheduled ceremony had 43 attendees. A fraction of the original crowd, but the ones who mattered. Marcus stood in his cap and gown near the stage. His father was there now, along with his girlfriend. The dean had been replaced, a temporary administrator, someone with no history, no vendetta. The Master Chief walked directly to the microphone without asking permission. The temporary administrator didn't stop him. "We're looking for Danielle Ross," the Master Chief said. His voice carried the weight of command, the kind of tone that silences crowds without raising volume. Or as we knew her, Gunny Ross. The words landed like a charge set precisely at load-bearing support. Murmuring rippled through the bleachers. Marcus's face went pale. "She's here," the Master Chief continued, his eyes finding her in the stands. "She's been here the whole time. Most of you walked past her and never saw anything but a nurse." The air pressure changed. That's the only way to describe it, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The chaplain stepped forward. He held a single page, the paper yellowed and official, and his voice shifted into the cadence of ceremony, neither reading nor reciting, but speaking words that had been spoken over fallen soldiers for generations. Unit citation. For extraordinary valor in Kandahar, when Gunnery Sergeant Ross performed combat casualty care under enemy fire for 17 continuous hours, refusing evacuation until every teammate was stabilized. 17 hours. The number hung in the silence like a weight. For exceptional bravery under direct fire. For maintaining standard of care in a collapsing compound. For saving lives that the military had classified as expendable. He lowered the paper. That's what extraordinary valor means in plain English. The rear admiral took the microphone. His uniform alone commanded attention, stars and ribbons and the bearing of someone who had signed orders that moved fleets. "Gunnery Sergeant Danielle Ross," he said, and the rank hung in the air like a rank should, like a title earned in blood and dust. Bronze Star for actions in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. He paused. Silver Star for leadership under fire. Another pause. Danielle's hands remained folded. 2 Purple Hearts. He waited. And a Navy Cross. The words felt like they had weight. For extraordinary heroism. For saving the lives of 5 teammates in an urban combat scenario while sustaining multiple gunshot wounds. The rear admiral's eyes found hers across the room. The President of the United States awarded this decoration. You don't leave that ceremony early because a dean has a personal vendetta. Nobody moved. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hymn overhead. Marcus stood frozen, his cap still in his hands, his mind reassembling every childhood memory, every time his mother had left for training, every scar he'd seen on her shoulders and never asked about, every conversation that had stopped abruptly when he entered a room. Then a man in a dark suit stood. No insignia. No introduction. The kind of man whose authority came from the places his credentials couldn't be mentioned. "Ms. Ross," he said, his voice conversational, almost apologetic. "The agency knows you by a different designation entirely." He let that phrase settle. "One that remains classified. That will always remain classified." He turned toward Dr. Mercer. The temporary dean's face had gone the color of old porcelain. "This is a federal subpoena," the man continued, extending an envelope with the precision of someone serving a warrant. "Regarding scholarship fund reallocations. Your office. Your authorization codes. 17 years of documentation that our auditors have already acquired." His tone never changed. He could have been discussing the weather. "You have 48 hours to retain counsel." Dr. Mercer's hands were shaking. That was the thing nobody ever prepared you for, the moment when institutional power evaporated like morning fog. When the phone calls you could make didn't matter anymore because someone else's phone calls had already been made. When the donor connections and board relationships and tenure itself became irrelevant because federal law enforcement had arrived, quiet and patient, with paper that had teeth. The Master Chief turned back to Danielle one final time. "Welcome home, Gunny," he said simply. Then he and the chaplain and the rear admiral and the man in the dark suit filed out of the convention center with the same unhurried pace they'd entered. They didn't look back. The security guard, the same one who'd escorted Danielle from the original ceremony 3 weeks ago, walked over to Dr. Mercer with a cardboard box. It was the kind of box used for moving office contents. His expression was neutral, professional, but there was something in his eyes that might have been satisfaction. "I believe you know the way out," he said. The same words he'd used with Danielle. The same tone. The same implications. Except this time they meant something different entirely. Marcus was walking toward his mother before anyone else had moved. He didn't ask questions. He just hugged her, his graduation cap tumbling to the floor, and held on like he was verifying she was real and wouldn't disappear again. Danielle's hands rested on his back, steady and certain, the hands that had held his first pediatric foot when he was 4 years old and febrile, the hands that had saved 5 Navy SEALs in the dark while rounds came through concrete walls. 6 months later, a wedding invitation arrived at Sacred Heart's main reception desk, addressed to Danielle Ross, RN. The envelope was heavy stock, cream-colored, the kind of thing that suggested Marcus had become the kind of adult who made careful decisions about stationery. Inside, beneath the formal printing, was a handwritten note in Marcus's precise, careful script. "Mom, I Googled your medals. I'm sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry I didn't ask. You've always been my hero, and now I know why you never needed to tell me." A postscript, added in what looked like a moment of dark humor, also, "Dean Mercer is working at a strip mall urgent care clinic on Capital Boulevard. The one between the tax prep service and the nail salon. Karma is real." Danielle wore a simple blue dress to the wedding, navy blue, the color of dress uniforms. The folded flag from Kandahar stayed in her purse where it had lived for 8 years, where it would live for the rest of her life. She arrived late enough that no one would ask her to stand for photographs, found a seat in the back, watched her son marry a woman with intelligent eyes and a voice like grace itself. During the reception, Marcus tapped his glass and told a room of 48 people about his mother, the nurse who was actually a Navy SEAL, about a surgical procedure in Kandahar that had saved lives classified above top secret, about extraordinary valor that nobody had ever bothered to ask about until the federal government showed up in dress whites. Danielle sat quietly, her hands folded the way she'd learned to fold them in a combat medicine course in 2010, uncomfortable with the attention, ready to move to the next crisis if the need arose. But it didn't. The evening proceeded with a kind of peaceful, ordinary joy that took more courage than combat. After the toasts, Marcus found her in the quiet corner where she'd settled, away from the dancing and laughter. "You don't have to hide anymore," he said. His voice carried the weight of a son who had finally met his mother, not the woman who'd raised him, but the woman she actually was. Danielle looked at him for a long moment. She thought about anonymity versus erasure, about healing versus disappearing, about the difference between being invisible and being safe. She'd worked at Sacred Heart for 2 years since her reinstatement, training new nurses in emergency procedures she never quite explained how she learned. She'd turned down 3 job offers from larger hospitals, stayed in Raleigh deliberately, built a life that was quiet and purposeful and contained. The flag stayed in her purse. The scars stayed on her arms under the long sleeves she wore even in summer. The memories stayed in the locked compartment of her chest where they belonged. "I'm not hiding," she said finally. "I'm choosing." She squeezed Marcus's hand. "There's a difference." The next morning, Danielle arrived at Sacred Heart at 5:38 a.m., 10 minutes before shift change. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and coffee, like every hospital at every hour, like home in a way that Kandahar never could be. She checked the night shift reports, reviewed the stable patients and the ones who were declining, adjusted and fall line on a post-operative cardiac patient with movements so precise they looked like choreography. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, sinus rhythm, beautiful and consistent and full of promise. She continued her rounds, just another nurse on another shift, exactly where she'd chosen to be, in the place where saving lives happened quietly, without medals or recognition or federal subpoenas. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've made it this far, you know the truth about the people around you. The ones you pass in hospital corridors, the ones you dismiss without asking their names, they might be carrying medals you'll never see. Subscribe for more stories about the invisible heroes walking among us, the ones who choose compassion over credit, service over recognition. Like this video, comment below with the first moment you realized someone wasn't who you thought they were, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story like Danielle's.